Hello everyone. In today's video, I'll demo how an external XML entity, also called XXE vulnerability, is exploited. We'll also take a look at what a typical XXE vulnerable source code looks like. We'll go over how the payload is constructed to execute the attack. I'll be demoing this on a vulnerable web application that I created called PinewoodStore. Before we get started, let's look at a few basic concepts about XXE, how the payload is constructed. That way it would be clear when we demoing the exploit. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at what a typical XXE payload looks like. Now the top part, you have what's called document type declaration, and the bottom part, this part is actually just a regular XML. Now the most important part is the top part, document type declaration. Now when an attacker constructs a payload like this, what he's doing is uh, letting the parser library know that they would like to extend the functionality by declaring their own entity. Now, if the code allows it, obviously. So they're declaring, they're listing this doc type called example, and I'm gonna declare my own entity called my entity, and the contents of this entity is gonna refer to a system file located in this location. So basically it. And the next part is they're trying to use the entity they declared, in this case, my entity. So that I hope that kind of clears it. But just to understand, it's like two parts. The first part, less than or equals to, inside of it is just going to be exclamation mark and the keyword doc type. And the type of the doc type, in this case, let me call mine user. Now, inside of it is where you declare the entity. And always the entity needs to be enclosed inside uh, square brackets. And in not only square brackets, it needs to be enclosed in the usual less than or equals to less than and greater than. And you would use the exclamation mark as well. And the keyword here when you're defining the entity is going to be entity. And you would have an entity name. Let's call it entity 1. So this is a basic construct. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this one out and I'm going to expand it because this is not complete. So we declared it. The next thing what we need to do is the content of it. What the attacker is doing anyway. The content of this entity that I declared, what would I like it to be? And basically what he's saying is it needs to be a system file located in this directory. In this case, etc password. Now, the attack I'm going to demonstrate is going to be on a Windows machine. So I'm going to construct one out of a Windows directory. So I'm going to still use system keyword, and this is going to be directory. Now, the way you list out a directory is a file, column, 3 slashes, and your file, including the directory. Now, I want to use a host file in Windows. So now in Windows, what makes it different is you have to specify C colon. Now, the entity part is complete. I expanded it. So let's go ahead and cut it and replace what we have here. Now the doc type declaration is complete with the entity declaration as well. The next thing is obviously we need to use this entity that we declared in the XML document. Now the XML documents that I use, I'm gonna pass it on using the field value email. So what I'm gonna do is now this is important because if you don't do that, what the parser is going to do is it's just going to treat it as a normal string. You need to include what's called ampersand or and when you're specifying the entity in here. If you don't specify that, what the parser is going to think is just going to be, well, it's just a string that you're passing. But if you specify ampersand, it's going to know, okay, this variable is referring to the entity that you declared here. And also semicolon at the end. So if you don't specify that, let's say if I take this one out, it's going to think, okay, it's just passing an email with a email entity one semicolon. But if you specify the end, it's going to know, okay, it's referring to the entity he declared in a doc type. So this is important because if you're not going to have the output that you want, and the exploit's not going to work. So now everything's complete. This is how you construct it. Let's go ahead and demo this. All right, I have the PinewoodStore open. Let's go to the contacts page. This is the one where I introduced the vulnerability at the end. Now, let me go ahead before we get started up. Actually, let's go ahead and clear everything in here. Clear history. Let's make sure it's intercepted. So let's put some random name. Send an email. So let's send it to repeater. Obviously, I want to change the request, so I'm gonna drop it here and let's go. All right, so this is what the regular request looks like. What I'm going to do first thing, I want to demonstrate a couple of things, so I'm going to go ahead and send it to repeater because I want to see the output and I want to show you a couple of things. So I send it. If you notice here, this is the request part and this response part. This value is being reflected here. Now, when you're doing this kind of XXE or any kind of attack, if you find a reflected value, a variable that actually reflects back on the response, this is actually great. That's why this easier way to exfiltrate data, right? Let's say if I define my own doc type and I want to use that doc type in here, I would know the value of that doc type is actually going to be reflected back on the response. So I can get, let's say, some system file that is restricted or something after the parser processes the data and returns it. And it's going to return the value of the entity that I defined. In this case, it's just going to return the value of that file, whatever is actually inside that file. So I just wanted to show that the fact that we're getting reflection is actually a great way to show that it is exploitable. With that being said, let's go ahead and send it to repeater again so I can get it clean. And let's go back to our payload we constructed earlier on and let's bring it in. Let me, just in case, let me put it on the bottom. Oh. Duplicated it. All right, so the first thing is obviously let me delete this. So the entity, like I said, we get a reflection on here. So this is where I'm going to be replacing it at. And the doc type declaration is not going to change. So I'm going to go ahead, put it on top. So, all right, so we got this. I'm going to try to get Windows System 32 drivers at C host. Now, like I said, we get reflection here on the email part is being reflected on the response. So the entity that I defined, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and try to actually access it. That way, when it responds back, it will respond with the value of this file. That makes sense. I don't need this. So like we talked about earlier on, the way I access the value or let the parser know I was referring to the value is I need to specify the int, the variable name, entity1, and semicolon. So let's go ahead and send it. All right, so return was the content of the vulnerability has been exploited. Now the next thing is, let's go ahead and go back and take a look at it. This is what the back end looks like. Now I'm using a vulnerable source code, and basically what it is using a library called Document Builder Factory. Now what this is basically instantiating the object and creating any object, Java object factory, and so I can use it. Now, if you notice, there's actually a code that I escaped out. The reason why I did it is by default, if I were to allow this line, what that means is it disallows doc type declaration. What that means is what we talked about, this doc type declaration. If an attacker tries to use this attack and tries to get some data, it will return back saying you're not allowed to do that. The parser does give you an option to actually disable that feature. Now I commented it out so we can see what it looks like when this is disabled and when this is allowed. So what I'm going to do right now, since we already demonstrated that it exploited, let's go ahead and turn this back on. So it disallows you or the attacker declaring your own doc type. Right now that's the case, so I'm gonna go ahead and save it. Obviously I need to restart the application. All right, let's go back to Burp Suite. I'm gonna go ahead and copy this to another tab. Now everything is the same except the fact that the backend change that we made. As you can see here, right now I'm getting doc type is disallowed. So it's not allowing me to declare my own new entity. That's the reason why you could use these libraries as long as you have the right configurations and know how to actually secure them. Now, this does not mean it's entirely secure. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we doing that, I would like to demonstrate how important it is that you follow the syntax when it comes to constructing the payload. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this back on by turning off this line. So what that means, it would allow doc type declaration. So let's terminate this. Let's restart. All right, it is back on. So right now, if I send it, yes, the application is still starting, so that's the reason why I didn't get anything. Let's go ahead and send it again. All right, so now I can exfiltrate, or I could look up that host file. Now, what I want to demonstrate is, let's go ahead and copy this to another tab. This is what I was referring to earlier on. I was talking about how important it is that you got this right. So let's say if I were to take this off, the end. Now the parser is not going to know I'm referring to the entity that I declared. Let me go ahead and send it. See, the parser thinks entity1 semicolon is just an email that I'm passing. So this doc type declaration and all that stuff, the payload that you constructed, it didn't work. The reason why it didn't work is because you gotta follow certain rules when you're declaring your entity, you're declaring your doc type, and also when you're actually trying to use the entity that you declared, you need to follow certain a certain syntax for it to work. Now, but if I were to add back this and send it, now it knows I'm referring to the entity, so it's gonna give me the contents of that file. And the second thing I was talking about is the semicolon. If you don't do that, still the parser is gonna error out and tell you, okay, you're missing this. The reference entity one must end. It does know that actually you're referring to this, but it basically would tell you, okay, it needs to end with this delimiter. So those are some of the things that you need to watch out for when you're testing this. If you want to get successful exploitation, then you need to kind of watch some of the things. So I'm gonna go ahead and send it, exploit it. The other thing is, as you notice here, the doc type declaration, right? The entity declaration, it always has to be inside a doc type. If you don't have it enclosed inside the doc type, it is not going to work. So let's go ahead and try to see, what if I send it without it being enclosed inside the doc type declaration, right? I want to be sure if it works. Because if it does work, that means is even though the doc type declaration is disabled, I can still use this. But that's not the case. It always, when you declare an entity, it needs to be inside the doc type. Now we only have the entity. I can send it this way. There is errored out. And I can also, if required, I can take this one out. Either way, it's not going to work. Whichever alternative way that you tried it. It's not well informed. So error parsing it. So when you're declaring the entity, it needs to be inside a doc type declaration. So that's one of the things I want to demo. Now, the fact that we turned on this feature, disallow doc type declaration, does that mean we are secured the application? There is no other way to exploit it. And definitely not. That's not the case. So next, what we're going to take a look at is actually, I'm going to go ahead and disable this, and we can try to see if we can exploit it the other way using another library called xinclude. All right, so the first thing is obviously we're going to disallow doc type declaration, like we've seen earlier on. So I'm going to go ahead. I included this line. I took out the comment. What that means is disallow doc type declaration, and it's set to true. So I'm going to go ahead, save it. Disconnect the application. All right, it's back on. All right, now let me go ahead and send this to another tab. As you can see, if I were to send it, I'm going to get the disallow doc type declaration. Now we're going to use what's called an xinclude. Xinclude is another kind of similar kind of, I'll say, to document type declaration, but it uses a mechanism for including external documents or fragments into an XML document. Now, what makes it different is you don't have to have a doc type declaration. So we can try to use that. As long as your application enables xinclude, it can still get exploited. So let's go ahead and take this one out. Now, what makes it different when it comes to xinclude is it doesn't actually require, first thing obviously, the most important part, it doesn't require any kind of document type declaration, but it would have certain formats you need to follow for it to work. The first thing is, as opposed to document type declaration, xincludes, you have to include certain uh, parameters, I should say, inside the XML document for it to work. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that. Now, X-includes has a namespace, basically a definition where what it does exists. And let me go ahead and paste it here. This is a namespace. Now, when you're defining it, the first thing when you're using X-include to exploit this functionality, the first thing that you need to decide, like I said, you would need some kind of XML document field that you need to decide on which one you're going to use, and you're going to include that X-includes library in that field, and you're going to define it. You're going to define certain parameters that X-includes requires, and as long as the backend application has enabled the X-include library, and I'm gonna go ahead and show you this. I've enabled the namespace, as you can see here. Set X-include aware is actually set to false. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead before we do anything. I'm gonna set this to true. What that means is it should be able to use X-includes. Let's go ahead and terminate this. Let's wait for it to. Now, while this is loading, let's take a look at the syntax. Now, inside of it, the first thing that you need to do when it comes to using it, like I said, the first thing you would decide on which one you're going to use. So I have an XML document, an entity user, inside of it, two fields, name and email. Now, the name is not reflected, the email is reflected. Obviously, the best choice would be email. So the first thing you need to do is you're going to go to the email part, and you're going to say XML namespace and equals, and you're going to put in that namespace that we copied. The second thing is inside of this email, you need to include parameters that the X-includes requires. And it needs to be enclosed in what's called XI I'm waiting for the application to start. I think it should be up right now. Let's take a look. Yeah, it's up. So yeah, the X-includes would have certain parameters that it needs to have. The first one is XI include. Obviously this, it would be sub-closing tag like this. And you would put this, I would expand this in a minute, but they would put this inside as a property of email. The first thing, the namespace inside the email saying XML namespace, and you can put that namespace. And also, sorry about that, you're gonna have to use XI, referring to X-includes. Now the next thing is you're gonna put this inside the email tag in here as a value of email, right? When you in XML, when you put in a value, you're gonna put, for instance, name. The value is Adrian Chapa. The same thing, email would need a value, and when you're exploiting it using X-includes, you would need to include this value. But it requires certain parameters, like I said. The first one would be XI, and you're gonna put include. And the next thing is how you're going to parse it. How you want the parser to parse it. And this last one and the most important one is a property called href. It's basically you telling it the fragment, where the fragment is located. If you don't include that, obviously it's not going to know. And we're going to use the same kind of format when it comes to showing the directory, which is file, colon, three slashes. Uh, I'm going to use the same thing that I used earlier on, which is a Windows, because I'm on a Windows system. Now, now we have expanded this. I'm going to put it here. So let's go ahead. As a matter of fact, let me leave it. Let me use another tab so that way we can see still I'm getting disallowed here, but the exploit here works. Yeah, so you can see here, it returned back the contents of my host. And I can show you if I go back and actually try to use one of this is the one that is actually successful. As you can see here, was successful. Is using doc type declaration. So if I try to do it, still it's saying disallowed, but if I'm using the X includes, because it doesn't require any doc type declaration, it would work. All right. So what can we do when it comes to the backend? Obviously, this needs to be turned off so that the code would not, the source code would know not to use this library method. Set include aware is a method, and obviously it's still using the document builder factory. Let's go ahead and turn this off and see what the output looks like. So to turn it off, I need to set it to false. I'm going to terminate this. Clear. Java application. So let's wait for it to finish. Mind you, it was working now. So if I send it now, because I turned it off, no data found. The only reason saying that is because of the code chain that I made. I said set namespace aware, include aware. It's not aware of this include, so it's not going to include another XML document, or it's not going to allow you to include. When it processes it, it's not going to use the X include method. So now that we demonstrated everything on Windows side, let's try to see if sometimes it would be good to know that you can do this on a Linux system as well. So first thing, I'm gonna go ahead and go back to the code. We can demonstrate both. So first thing, as a matter of fact, I already deployed the code to another VM, so I don't have to make it because this is a live code. The code that I deployed already, it already has the change. So as you see here, the IP address is 162 and the application is still running. This is the application. So if I try to access this application through an IP address, let's go back to my browser. This is a localhost one and the live one. And this is the one that I have deployed on a VM. Let's wait for it. Oh, okay, the proxy is turned on. Let me go ahead and turn it off. All right, so we still have it. Let me go to, this is on the Linux machine. So let's go ahead and catch this. And this is on the local machine. Let me close this. So this is on the Linux machine. And also let me go back to HTTP history. Let me clear it. Intercept. All right, let's go ahead and set it. As you can see here, the IP address is coming from that VM because I have the application already running. I created it as a jar and it's running. So the reason why I do that is I want to test it to make sure I can actually do the exploit on a Linux machine and also not on just on the local host, right? I like to test if the server is actually remote, how the code works. A repeater. Now we have this. We can use the same payload, obviously, but this is gonna be a Windows, Linux, Ubuntu machine, so we need to use something like etc host or etc shadow. All right, let's start with X include. Yeah, the name is relevant, not relevant, but I can put John Doe for this one. And as you can see here, it's going to 162 with my VM. Now, the only thing I need to actually include is, as you can see here, the file points to a Windows file, but Ubuntu VM. So let's do SC password first. As you can see here, it exploited it. So let's try another one, SC shadow. Yes, you can see. All right. So this is how you demonstrate how the XXE works. Like I said, there's settings that you can apply or your code level to secure that depending on what library you're using to parse XML. Some applications, most applications nowadays, they're staying away from using uh, XML as an input anyway. But yeah, all right, thank you for watching.